Let's see. Good afternoon. I'm Christine Castro with HYPR. And here with me today, I have Dan Moore from FusionAuth and Sean Connolly from HYPR. And we're going to be talking to you today about how to set up single sign-on for Zendesk using FusionAuth and HYPR. Just a couple housekeeping items to get out of the way. If you've got questions during this broadcast, please feel free to send in those questions via the chat box, and we'll try to hit all those questions up during the Q&A section. And you will receive a copy of this presentation at the conclusion. There'll be an on-demand recording. And also at the end, please do let us know how we did. Leave us some feedback, and if there's anything that you'd like to see in the future, don't hesitate to let us know. Our contact information will be on the very last slide. And now I'd like to introduce Dan Moore from FusionAuth.
Hello, thanks for joining us. So I am here to represent FusionAuth, and we are as this slide says, complete identity solution. And I think two things that really differentiate us that might be interesting to you are the fact that we are really built for developers, and that means that almost everything you can do via our user interface, you can script via our APIs. We also have a very CI/CD friendly initialization file called Kickstart. And we also are extremely agnostic about where you install us, whether it's using Docker, installing us in the cloud, Kubernetes, downloading a zip file, a Debian installation file, and RPM. We install anywhere, and you can be up and running in minutes. So that's one of our strengths. I have been working as a developer for a number of years. I have built plenty of authentication systems, and one of the reasons I joined FusionAuth is I don't want anyone else to go through that. Authentication is something that is really, really important to get right, but it's not really a differentiator for anybody. Because the only time when people care about authentication is when it doesn't work. So I'm also involved in the Boulder Ruby meetup and am active on Twitter. So I hope I can meet you there.
And hello, everyone. I'm Sean Connolly, here representing with HYPR, and very excited to be here with FusionAuth to go through just the benefits of our technologies together, and how HYPR is also just driving true passwordless authentication into enterprises and organizations. And what you'll see today is that HYPR itself is providing, as the slide here says, the benefits of smart card authentication and PKI authentication, but with the convenience of doing so on your phone. So HYPR itself, we call ourselves truly passwordless because we're eliminating any form of a shared secret. You'll see that today that together our technologies allow you to take these benefits and ensure that every user can get access into their federated environments or development environments or apps that you've developed, but not use any form of a shared secret during that end user authentication. A little bit about myself. I've been with HYPR for 3 years now. I'm the VP of Field Engineering. Prior to that, I was also in the authentication space on the engineering side, and have roughly 10 years of experience in just authentication and development industries. So very, very excited today, as I had mentioned, and looking forward to continuing this.
Great. So we're going to jump into the demo, but real quick before we do that, this diagram explains one of the ways that we at FusionAuth think about authentication, and we call this the auth bottleneck pattern. And on the left-hand side, you end up having custom applications you write, applications that your employees might use, like Google Apps or WordPress. And then we have FusionAuth in the middle, kind of acting as a traffic manager. And then on the right-hand side, we have identity providers. So this pattern really works well because it lets you meet your users where they are, right? You can allow certain sets of users to use use HYPR's true passwordless MFA. You also can, if you're have a custom application that's aimed at consumers and they want to log in using Facebook, you can provide that as well. So you can have a central point of management, and that will reduce your operational complexity by using FusionAuth, and then you can offer the benefits of the ease of passwordless authentication using HYPR. So let's go ahead and jump into the demo. All right, so for this purpose of this demo, I set up 2 cloud environments. FusionAuth is over here, and it's running FusionAuth Cloud, and then I also signed up for Zendesk. And both of these are basically completely new installs. So this is what you would see if you went and signed up for FusionAuth and Zendesk yourself. So the first thing you're going to want to do is to start this integration is to create an application. An application in FusionAuth is basically something that you can sign into, a user can sign into. So let's go ahead and add one, and you can have unlimited applications within FusionAuth. So we're going to create one called Zendesk, and we're going to configure it later. Then one of the first things we want to do is create roles within Zendesk, within the FusionAuth Zendesk application, excuse me. And these, doesn't really matter what they're called for FusionAuth. FusionAuth just treats these as strings. However, these do matter to the end application. So for Zendesk, which is a customer support application, you have 3 classes of users. You have admin users that basically can do whatever they want, have full control over the application. You have agents, which are dedicated to answering user questions and solving tickets. And then you have users, which don't actually have an explicit role, but anybody who doesn't have the admin or the agent role gets the user privileges. So we're going to, since we're managing all of our users in FusionAuth, we need to have some way to tag them as with whatever role they should have in Zendesk, and that's what we're doing here. All right, so the next thing we're going to do is basically write a little bit of code to map between the roles in FusionAuth and the roles in Zendesk. And the way we do that in FusionAuth is called a Lambda. And there are multiple types of Lambdas, but we're going to use the populate Lambda. And basically what this is going to do, it's a little bit of JavaScript that puts the roles that are pulled off of essentially the user object or the user registration object and pushes that into the response that we're sending to Zendesk. So this is basically saying, hey, take the roles that this user's assigned and pass them to the SAML response so that Zendesk can then examine the response and assign the roles within the Zendesk application. The next thing we want to do now is complete our configuration of the Zendesk application. We need to enable SAML, and this is all pretty well documented on Zendesk's site. We want to make sure that we set up the issuer correctly. And one thing that caught me when I was preparing for this demo is you definitely don't want a slash on the end of this. That's going to cause you some pain. And then we are going to put in the callback. The rest of these we can leave default, except for we're going to have that Lambda execute. So every time the SAML process starts, we're going to add those roles in for a given user. So let's go ahead and save that off. The next thing we need to do is add a user. And so we're going to do 2 things here actually, and I should have given this a little bit before, but we're going to create a user that logs in via normal, boring password and username authentication. And then we're going to create a user that logs in using HYPR's MFA solution. So let's add the first user. And then one thing that you have to do is you can have, as I mentioned, as many applications as you want. And so you need to associate a user to an application. In this case, we're going to have the agent at example.com user be associated with the Zendesk application, and within that application, it's going to have the agent role. All right, so we're pretty much done setting up FusionAuth right now. We're gonna have to kind of go back to here for some details, and now we need to actually configure Zendesk. So again, this is kind of a standard Zendesk install. I am an admin, so I'm going to go to the admin center, and then I'm going to go to the single sign-on section of the security center, and I'm going to configure SAML. So I'm enabling that, and then there are some URLs that I need to pull from FusionAuth. And the login URL corresponds to the Zendesk SSO URL. The logout URL corresponds to the logout URL. And then this certificate is something that's used to kind of verify the SAML transaction is happening in a secure way. And for that, we're going to need to go to the key master. And this is a SAML key that was generated for us automatically. Pull that fingerprint, place that there. And we could limit certain authentication methods to certain IP ranges. We're not going to do that for this demo. All right, so now we've configured the single sign-on with SAML. We also need to basically tell Zendesk which set of users should use SAML, because we can set it up for end users or staff members or both. In this case, we're going to set it up for both. And for end users, we now have SAML enabled. And it's going to give us a warning sign. And I wouldn't worry too much about this, because basically you can, if for some reason you forget your FusionAuth password or whatnot, and you're an administrator, you can kind of go in via a Zendesk provided backdoor. And we're selecting single sign-on. There's SAML, and there's that backdoor that I mentioned. And essentially, we're done. So let's go ahead and log in with the with log into Zendesk with FusionAuth. So this is the default FusionAuth login screen, but you can definitely theme this if you want. And here we are. So we are logged in as the agent user. You can see it pull over our email address. You can also push over other information like the number and you can have that number be controlled in FusionAuth and then pushed into Zendesk. So that is the boring way to do it, right? That is using our username and password. Let's go ahead and set up HYPR integration. So the first step is to create an identity provider. And the application ID and relying party URL are provided for you by HYPR. And then we need to make sure that we enable it for the Zendesk application. And you can have, if you had different HYPR applications for different customer-facing applications or employee-facing applications, you could configure a different application ID and relying party URL for each application. We're not going to do that again in this demo. And the other thing that's maybe worth noting is create registration. This is a way for you, if you have a identity provider like HYPR that has a set of users that are already kind of registered with it, they can automatically, if they authenticate successfully with HYPR, have that registration tying them to the Zendesk FusionAuth application happen automatically. Now, in this case, we're going to create our users because we don't want to let anybody register and become an agent in Zendesk. So we're going to disable that feature. Make sure this. All right, so we've configured the identity provider. Now we're going to add a user that is a HYPR user. And we can put anything here because it doesn't really matter. All right, the last thing we need to do is make sure that this user is associated with the Zendesk application and has the correct role. All right, so my part is done. I'm going to hand things back over to Sean. He's going to show you how it would look for a person to log in with a HYPR account using into Zendesk. Thank you.
And Dan, I appreciate that. I'm going to strive to be the best Zendesk agent for you. So let me share my screen again. And now that I'm set up as a Zendesk agent, I first need to just log in. And you'll see that I have HYPR actually installed on my Windows workstation. So here on the left, this is just my iPhone. And on the right, I'm going to log into my workstation and make sure that I can get into that portal. So all I need to do, because I've HYPR enabled, is just provide a biometric authentication. And this is where I'm seamlessly authenticated in. And Dan was nice enough to also put an icon on my desktop for my Zendesk login. So if I click on this, I'm going to get just sent to that federated access that we just established. And I'm going to type my username in. And as Dan had mentioned, there's no longer a need for me to have that password. So you'll see the authentication gets sent to my phone. I get prompted again for a biometric. And I get fully passwordless authentication into my Zendesk portal. And again, Dan, this is where I can do everything for you as your agent here. So a lot just happened there, and you'll see it's an extremely quick user experience. I was able to log in without a password into my workstation. I was able to log in without a password now into the portal as well. And what I would like to do is just take a second to talk through really what happened and what were the benefits of what happened. So if I shift back into the PowerPoint that we had up, there's an authentication flow here that really took place behind the scenes. And you'll see because of the benefits of FusionAuth and HYPR being deployed together, this authentication flow is now enforced at my desktop and now enforced at Zendesk. And when I went to log into Zendesk there, FusionAuth was set up for SAML authentication. And then HYPR, when I got the authentication request, typed in my username, all I had to do was type in my username and a request got sent out to HYPR's cloud. And in that request, there was a challenge and a policy that got sent back. And the challenge is going to be unique to every single event that gets triggered. And the policy itself is going to be something that a HYPR administrator could dictate, saying, you need to log in with a fingerprint, let's say, or a Face ID if you have a newer iPhone, or a PIN. You have full control in real time over what that policy would be. And as I was prompted on the phone, I had used my Touch ID to authenticate myself. There's also a private key that is correlated to that Touch ID. And that private key, what it's going to do is sign the response back to the HYPR cloud. And HYPR itself is only storing public keys. So we will never hold sensitive information and never hold anything secure pertaining to your environment. And this is where there's the benefit of taking authentication and putting it to the cloud, because there is nothing sensitive needed anymore to give you that authentication. And when the public key was able to verify the signature of that private key, the authentication itself was completed. So in this flow, there was truly no shared secret that was ever utilized. And the end user themselves, they get the benefit of a very seamless user experience. So within about, let's say 10 minutes, Dan was able to set up Zendesk for a truly passwordless authentication using FusionAuth and HYPR. And now the end users themselves, they get the benefits that I mentioned earlier that are authentication equal to smart card or PKI authentication, but they have this simple and streamlined user experience. So with all of that said, we were able to get everything up and running. I am now going to open it up to the general floor for questions. And as Christine said at the beginning, Q&A can be done within the chat itself. And it looks like we have our first question. So the first one coming in, what are other services you can use FusionAuth and HYPR for? And Dan, I don't know if you want to just take that from the start from your FusionAuth perspective, and I'd be happy to touch on it as well.
Sure, that's great. Yeah, I think that basically with FusionAuth, any OIDC compatible or SAML compatible service can be used. And we've talked to a lot of our customers, and there are things that vary from custom applications that are using libraries to integrate with that, to things like Google G Suite, WordPress, and other open source systems like NodeBB. But the real premise of standardization around authentication is that anything that talks SAML, V2, or OIDC should be able to integrate with FusionAuth, and from there integrate with HYPR. So that's kind of my side of it. What's your side, John?
Yeah, and I would expand it a bit too. As you saw in my demonstration, HYPR was configured at the desktop, and that's an area where we, from a HYPR perspective, want to take passwordless authentication and apply it to every aspect of an organization. So an enterprise admin, let's say, can take HYPR and apply passwordless authentication to their endpoints. FusionAuth is deployed as the single sign-on provider, the identity provider. HYPR can provide passwordless authentication there. And there's other examples where HYPR and FusionAuth are being deployed for developers, and for developers to just build in this seamless authentication within their own applications. So HYPR wants to empower enterprise admins as much as developers. And we have software development kits, SDKs that are made available for mobile applications, for web applications. And that's where there's a lot of value in our platforms together as well. So there is a second question. Have your integrations together been used in production? And if so, what were some of those use cases? So I can kick off that one as well. And just as I had mentioned in my prior response, we absolutely have production use cases together. And some of those examples are either ranged between applications of single sign-on using us, or one of our more larger production examples is where developers are using the platforms together. And developers are building in functionality of FusionAuth in their own applications and taking in HYPR's SDKs in their own applications and using it for their consumers as well. So I won't speak to the details of the integrations here, but everything we've shown you, the benefits we've shown you, those are being used in production. And there are consumer applications that have our technologies built into it as well. Dan, I don't know if you want to touch on anything else there.
I think you covered that beautifully, Sean.
I appreciate that. So when I go on to the next question, one for HYPR here. Does HYPR work with BYOD or only with MDM enrolled devices? And I can confirm, and there's a multitude of options there. We can work with MDM solutions, but there's by far no requirement for an MDM to be deployed. So we can absolutely be deployed along BYOD programs. And as mentioned earlier, both HYPR and FusionAuth, we offer a lot of tools to empower developers. So we can even take it a step further and say, integrate into your own applications natively. So for the next question, can HYPR be used with multiple FusionAuth applications, even if I need to provide different HYPR configurations and per application? And Dan, I know you showed that earlier. I don't know if you want to expand upon that.
Yeah, so I mentioned that briefly earlier, but basically the way it works is that every single application that's created within FusionAuth, I think we've overloaded the word application here, to be honest with you, but every application that you create in FusionAuth that is something that a user can sign into can have its own unique HYPR configuration. So you can have things that are again, just for employees, things that are a certain subset of employees, and you can manage that all within FusionAuth. And then you can, when you get the configuration information from HYPR, plug it right in. Again, you can actually create these identity provider configurations via API. So you can even have an automated system that can provision something with HYPR and then create an identity provider in FusionAuth, tie it to an application, and make that passwordless sign-in accessible to the set of users that are associated with that application.
That's great, Dan. So looking at one of the next questions here, in what ways do you see UX improving by providing passwordless authentication? And I'm going to just broaden the response here because there's multiple benefits from a HYPR perspective. When we're talking about passwordless authentication, as I had mentioned, HYPR and FusionAuth together have a very holistic story here. And HYPR itself, it's providing passwordless authentication to every aspect of the enterprise. So as I showed earlier, if I was logging into my Windows machine and then to FusionAuth, HYPR strives to ensure there's never a shared secret use either at Windows or FusionAuth to log me in. And the same concept applies when I'm, let's say, doing RDP into Windows servers, if I'm logging into MacBooks. No matter what aspect of the enterprise is in play for the end user, we want to ensure there's no password there. Now, it's clear the end user, because there is no password, is going to have the benefit of not remembering passwords. It's going to be far simpler for them to get in. And those are great from a UX perspective. And one thing that I just personally, 3 years I've been with HYPR, one thing that I've loved about it is we're providing you that best of breed user experience, but inherently making those experiences more secure as well. So it's that balance that everyone talks about in security. It's usability versus security. And I finally in my career get to honestly sell a technology and deploy a technology that is providing you both and is ensuring that users get a great experience and have an experience that is much more secure. And Dan, I'm sure you can elaborate on this much more than I can, but that's also where a lot of the value of FusionAuth comes in, because it's giving you this ability to take the technology of HYPR and then apply that to any of your applications. And those could be cloud applications, on-prem, federated applications, or apps that you've developed. And because FusionAuth can then streamline that integration and give you the capability of using HYPR, that really helps you enable that user experience and security benefits to any aspect of your enterprise or consumer applications.
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at what we did today in 10, 15 minutes, and you think about what it would take to develop the integrations yourself, it becomes clear that there's like a developer UX story too, right? Like I think Sean did a great job talking about the end user or the enterprise admin UX experience, which HYPR definitely makes just far better. But I think as a developer, you really aren't, you should absolutely focus on auth. You should absolutely focus on making a smooth authentication experience, but really your users are coming to you for the application functionality. Right. So what we want to do, FusionAuth and HYPR want to take that off your plate, make it possible to deliver just a really astonishing, very easy login experience, and have you focus on building what is going to differentiate your product.
So I'm gonna actually join a couple of these questions here, and it's great seeing similar questions being asked. So there's questions here about just fallback options, and we showed it with Zendesk, but more holistically speaking, what are the options made available through FusionAuth and HYPR should someone lose or have their phone stolen, let's say. And tied into that, one of the other questions that I see here is how can we deregister or manage these users in these consoles? So the reason I'm combining them is that they're almost hand in hand. And what HYPR strives to do from our technology stance is we want to ensure that we're empowering help desk agents. So I was an agent, let's say in Zendesk, or an agent for employees that has deployed HYPR and FusionAuth together. And should someone lose their device, I as an agent am empowered by HYPR to have things like recovery options made available to me. It's where I can send these users, let's say, a magic link to grant them access back into and enroll a new device. Or I can provision them something like a token, a FIDO token that they can then use to authenticate themselves with our joint solutions. And that ensures that we are making options and paths available for your help desk administrators to go in and grant access back in for end users to be able to get that recovery access and to re-enroll themselves. There's also the ability from a HYPR stance, both through API or through the HYPR admin console, which we did not show earlier, but there's options there for you to manage those devices granularly to, let's say, deprovision a device that's lost. And Dan, you even showed earlier in the FusionAuth console where you were able to create me a user, and I was able to authenticate with it immediately after that. And I'm sure you can expand here, just what other options are there for you to be able to then provision access or grant access?
Yeah, absolutely. So FusionAuth has kind of two major interfaces, and the first was what you saw in the demo, the admin interface. And what I was logged in as was basically a kind of a super admin, but there's a rich set of roles for the FusionAuth application itself that can be assigned granularly to users, to basically desktop support or customer support users that can do such things as reset a user's passwords. They can take actions on a user so that they could conceivably, this is more on the application side where they can like ban a user for a certain period of time, but those are all kind of customizable. So you can build those into your application if you need to. But the admin interface is a great option. You also have the option of, again, using those APIs and building your own custom system to basically you can build your own web application, and then you can drive everything you want within FusionAuth from those APIs. So if you don't want to expose the FusionAuth admin panel for whatever reason, you can build your own very limited panel that might, for instance, just let someone click a button to reset a user's password, and you can integrate that into your own systems. There's also a user accessible system, right, where you can do things like login. Well, we already saw the login piece. You can also set up self-registration. So you can, with FusionAuth, using the provided OAuth and login functionality, you can give your users a lot of control, but you can also build on top of the APIs to give another set of users, support staff or whatnot, plenty of options for doing what Sean mentioned in terms of letting people reset their own password, or not reset their own passwords, kind of access their own authentication. Control their own authentication. Thank you.
So this last question I'm seeing here is, I think, very applicable to what we've shown, and actually a good one for me or for us to touch on. But in short, what is next? After removing passwords, now that I've had Zendesk integrated, what is next? And I think that's a very important question. And something that I just personally take is when I'm speaking with customers, it's let's have a clear vision of how we get enterprises to become passwordless. And from my perspective, you have HYPR integrated with Zendesk, and that's a phenomenal start. Let's look where else are users using passwords. And in the scenario that we showed today where HYPR's deployed on the desktop, HYPR's deployed with FusionAuth with Zendesk, in most scenarios, if you have HYPR deployed with your endpoints and then with an identity provider, like FusionAuth here, that is typically going to reduce your password surface by about 90%, where, if not more, where that's where the majority of the time end users are typing their passwords. And like I had mentioned, we should build just a clear strategy from there where else are passwords in use, and how do we get you to a place where they are no longer in use and we're eliminating those passwords? And Dan, I would imagine it's very similar for you. Just how do we expand out the use of FusionAuth, and where else can we drive value that's inherent to you and to the users that are using it? But I'll let you just talk to it from a FusionAuth perspective too.
Yeah, I mean, I think you did a great job of explaining what the end goal is, right? Which is getting authentication out of the way so people can do their jobs. And we see that with FusionAuth as well. And once you bring in one application, you've done a lot of the hard work. Start bringing in other applications. Where else do you see people authenticating? Where else are people building their own user stores? Right? And why are they doing that? Why aren't they bringing things into a centralized place where the user gets one piece, one place to authenticate, and the organization gets one view of all their users, which is kind of the end goal for everyone. So that's what I have to say about that. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally agree there. Now, I do not see any more questions. And I do really appreciate everyone's time, your time, Dan, and thought this was a great session. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you all, everyone, for attending. And FusionAuth and HYPR work great together, and we really appreciate your time today.